still in school and listening and watching my exposés himself. Now, that was the way he introduced me. But the day that I talked about the incoming of Nibiru, he was freaked out. And the bottom line is this: he's scared. It's an internal thing. I'm not going to say that it's financial. I believe it's totally an internal, personal thing with him. And the concept, the things I was talking about, are very frightening. And some people, are just not going to buy into it until it's, until it's a vivid, in your backyard, it's all over kind of a situation. And up to that point, there are many people, including Alex, that are just frightened off by this. Now, what I would like to... Yes, go ahead. Yes.
I wanted to get Dr. Beer. Kenneth Beer is with us. He's been doing the radio show here with us now since all the way back to 2011 when we started it, and he's really familiar with your work all the way back to WWCR and Shortwave Patriot Radio. And Kenneth worked with Bill Cooper in Kaji back in the 90s. Kenneth, say hello.
Hey, Bob, it's good to actually hear you on the show. I remember hearing you years ago on Patriot Broadcast Networks and various forums, and it's amazing that you're actually on the show now. So I'm all ears tonight, and I can't wait to hear what you're going to share. But I've followed you for so long, and I'm kind of like Alex Jones with you. You opened my eyes.
Well, thank you. I greatly appreciate that. And what I probably should do is, I have to do this very briefly because I've been doing it so long, and my personal story is so complex and what have you so I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. But for the people that do not know who I am, they can go, of course, to my website, which is bobfletcherinvestigations.com. Now, if you just go on Google and put in Bob Fletcher, you'll end up there also, because I'm kind of like all over the place there, sort of like a bad fungus, I guess. But at least to the bad guys in government. So as a matter of fact, I had to quote Senator Kerry, John Kerry, who's now, of course, Secretary of State. I had assisted his offices profusely many years ago in one of the inquiries relative to drugs and government officials. And I had just run for the United States Congress in 1990, and he asked me what if I. And matter of fact, I almost took that seat, but he asked me what would have happened if I had taken the seat and become up there in Congress. And I jokingly said, well, I would be the biggest pain in the butt that they ever had in Washington. And Senator Kerry's response there was that he said, I got news, you already are one of the biggest pains in the butts in Washington. And that was, of course, back in 1990. That's a long time ago. But it's one of the best things I ever heard out of a senator's mouth out of Washington, D.C., that I was already causing them more grief than they wanted to share. But for those folks who don't know me, I got involved totally non-intentionally. I had a company, was taken over. I merged. It's not taken over. It's not, well, yeah, maybe that is the right word. I merged my company with another company in Atlanta, Georgia in 1985 or 86, that period of time. And it turned out to be run and operating by a covert Central Intelligence national security operative who supplies weapons for all of the small wars that you referred to just a few minutes ago around the world that have been taking place. This was a Central Intelligence operation. They took over my business to use it as a covert front. And then, and again, it's totally unknown to myself. There's no way of knowing that until you're already into it. Once I had signed papers and merged, and a few months into it, then I started meeting all of these military generals and officers and covert operatives and Lieutenant Colonel Bo Greitz at that time is a good friend of mine. At that time, I met him when he had just come back from doing covert operations looking for prisoners of war, and that was in '86, that period of time, and they were still, Bo was still bringing and getting prisoners of war out of the old Vietnam War. And these people, of course, who I'm talking about, that supply the weapons for all these small wars, make multi-millions of dollars, and of course they also end up being involved with drug smuggling, Oliver North and all of that Iran-Contra business. I was a witness in that, and then became, because of chasing those people, one, of course, leads to another. I became involved with at least 8 to 10 very serious top-level investigations at the congressional level. Now, I also have to add that absolutely none of them go anyplace. They are all complete garbage for the television for the most part, and to get senators and congressmen reelected because they show you all the wonderful things they were trying to do to clean up America, and in most cases it's all garbage. Now, put that aside. That's how I got involved with this stuff of chasing and following, going after criminal people, criminal personalities at the highest levels of our government, all the way up to the White House, and it's nonpartisan. They're crooks, liars, and thieves on both sides of the fence. Anybody that goes up there as an honest congressman, and I will use Sonny Bono as a perfect example, anybody that gets in there and goes and ends up getting into the Senate and the Congress, that basically at the very beginning they kind of pull you aside and have a little meeting with you, which basically means that if you come up here and cause a lot of grief, you'll not be back here again for a second term. If you come up and you cooperate, things will run really smooth, and you can move up to the highest levels in our government if you're a good guy. From their point of view, a good guy is somebody that keeps their mouth shut regardless of what they see. And in Sonny's case, he was appalled when he got up into the den of thieves in Washington and realized how unbelievably criminal everybody was up there. And there's many, many wonderful stories, but we don't have time to get into those this evening. But nonetheless, Sonny, I bring him up because when he and I worked with Sonny, supplying him with information on and documentation, the best that you can possibly get, supplied him with reams and reams of information related to the Central Intelligence involvement and other agencies, embassies and everybody else, with the drug smuggling, murder, and assassinations. When I worked with him supplying material, it was probably over a year, and then got down to really sharpening pencils, and finally his office called me back and told me that as soon as Sonny got back from the Christmas holidays, the first thing on the calendar was the investigation at the Congressional Intelligence level with all of my material and some material supplied by other people. They wanted to make sure I was ready to come back into Washington. I was living in Los Angeles at the time. Was I ready to come back and make sure that I had all of my stuff with me and that I assist them in bringing in other witnesses, which included drug smugglers and everybody you can imagine that was going to come forward to a brand new congressional investigation. And for one of the first times in the history of congressional inquiries, Sonny's offices informed me that they had subpoena powers. So they were going to be able to force people to come in and force them to either answer questions, or they actually could put them in jail until they decided to cooperate. That never happens normally in any of these inquiries. these guys can go in and sit down, and then they say, oh, I don't remember, or I can't come in right now, I'm doing something else, or this or that, whatever, and they sidestep the serious questions. That wasn't going to happen on this inquiry, and I loved it. I was overwhelmed with joy, and I thought, oh my God, this is going to be one of the first times we're going to be able to nail people right to the wall with unbelievable criminal activities coming right out of the White House and going up that far. And 10 days later, Sonny Bono was murdered on the top of the ski slopes in Nevada. Of course, they told everybody can remember, they had this traumatic announcement that Sonny had crashed into a tree and died from running into a tree with his skis on. And of course, nobody knew, because this has been kept very much undercover, the putting together this investigation. Nobody knew that at all. And of course, here I'm sitting in Los Angeles. I could have fallen off of my sofa, I guess, when I saw the news. When I called back into his offices, like a day or two afterwards, they wouldn't take my calls. And I thought, now this is the fellow the gentleman that ran the office basically for Sonny was a guy I had been close with. We had lunch when I was in Washington and what have you. As a matter of fact, one time when I had gone to Washington about 2 years ahead of this period of time, maybe a year ahead, I was in Washington to stop in there. I stopped in along with other activities I had there, and Frank, his name Frank Cullen, he came out and he said, I looked into the office and they had tapes up and they were blocking people off, and he came out and he said, we'll have to go down to the restaurant. We can't come in. And I said, what's going on? Because people were up on the desks, and there was powder all over the place from the ceiling, and they were climbing around doing all sorts of stuff. They had electronic equipment, 3 or 4 technicians wandering around in Sonny's offices in the Congress building. And I said, what is going on? And they said, Frank said, somebody's been tapping our entire offices. And now, read my lips, right? Tapping the offices of a congressman in the congressional buildings, in his office buildings. And I said, what in the world? I said, well, that doesn't surprise me what we're doing, what we're in the middle of right now. And, of course, that would have been at the very beginning of when I was supplying them with the information that I'm referring to of drug operations and what have you. So, anyhow, the bottom line is that's the kind of stuff I've been involved with, and literally I am afraid, I feel it has really devastated me. I feel that Sonny was murdered because of the material that I had supplied him with, and the investigation that was in fact ready to be cranked up. As soon as he got back, it was the first thing on the menu. Probably would have taken another, probably 15 days by the time after the first of the year, and we would have been up there, and it would have been devastating. I have live audio and I have live videos of Kuhn, one of the biggest drug smugglers in the world out of Burma, pulled out his records, and it was videotaped by Lieutenant Colonel Bo Greitz. He actually videotaped it when Kuhn saw, this is a drug smuggler in Burma that was the primary supplier of opiates into the free world for many years. He has 40,000 soldiers on the mountainside in Burma. So this is not like 5 guys, mixing funny white powder down in Mexico someplace. This is a huge operation with truckloads of the opiates coming out of the top of the hill in Burma. And he had live, which I supplied to Sonny, live recorded videos of Khonsa's entire distribution leadership in Chinese with their books. They open their books up going back many, many years, naming the Central Intelligence and ambassadorial level persons that had bought the drugs and set up the financing with the mafia, et cetera, read their names live out of the books on the hillside in China, in Burma. And that's the kind of evidence I had supplied, along with documentation and what have you, connecting right into people like Richard Armitage, who was Assistant Secretary of Defense for the United States of America under the Bush administration. Anyhow, that's the type of stuff I've been doing. So now let's figure out how that relates to the incoming of the possibility of Nibiru headed back in close to the to the Earth. What had happened a few years ago, I got looking into the extraordinary amount of money that was disappearing from the United States. Now, originally, I got to actually admit, I didn't know anything about Planet X. I had heard about it. It's one of those things like so many millions of things. You hear about stuff, but then if it doesn't move to the forefront or you're not directly involved with it, like in my case, if you're not directly involved with it, it's like just sort of out there, and nobody could. There was no real good evidence, as far as I was concerned, many, many years ago to ever pay any attention to it. But when I started looking into the money that was disappearing, now what am I talking about? For one thing I'm talking about is that all the gold in Fort Knox is gone. It no longer exists. It has been taken, stolen, removed. All right. Now, when I say all of it, whatever, maybe I'm talking about 97% of it or whatever. There's always a couple of roomfuls of gold that people could look at, but that wouldn't mean anything because if you didn't see all of it or you didn't have an accounting of it, an audit of all of it, it really doesn't mean anything. We have the big building in Fort Knox that's supposedly filled with it. And then, of course, we have it in New York City and a couple of major banks. They have some of it put away and, behind bars, if you will. And you could go there and probably still see some. They still have it in a few other locations. But for the most part, when you're talking tons of gold in gold bullion, tons and tons of it like there was at one point in time, that's not there anymore. That's just gone. We have about in 2010 or 11, whenever it was, after the financial banking crash around the world, the global pinch, all right, that affected everybody, 2008, 9, 10, that period of time, the banks or those banking entities from Germany and a few other places, they came forward over here to the Federal Reserve and they said, we need a couple of tons of our gold. They have, all those nations around the world have deposited their gold, but huge amounts of their gold, at the Fort Knox vaults as a security situation because some of the nations have always been a little shaky since World War II, and they worried basically about random overthrow of the governments or whatever, that type of insurgencies and what all. So they had put tons and tons. I believe the amount that Germany had in there was 1,500 tons of gold, just themselves. Well, anyhow, they came forward and asked for it, and the Federal Reserve said, oh, no, you can't get it right now. Uh-oh, what's wrong with that picture? If you got a couple $1,000 of mine, I would be upset. But if you had a couple 1,000 tons of gold of mine, I would really be upset. It's kind of figures that the average guy can't even perceive. So following that, there were several other nations that came forward they asked for their gold, and they were told the same thing. And interestingly, they were told to kind of get back in 2020, in the year 2020, they could probably get a good audit or some of their gold. That was kind of what the original answer was. And then, of course, we had Ron Paul came forward in Washington, and he has for several years said he wants an audit. You know, we require an audit. The United States wants to know if the gold is there, because he agrees with me, and that is that it's gone. And, of course, they told him the same thing. Basically, they just said, go away. You have no right to even require or request at the senatorial, congressional level that you do not have the right, because that's the way it's set up in terms of the Federal Reserve creation and regulations. Nobody outside of their own group of bankers had the ability to audit or even request an audit. And, of course, that doesn't happen. You know, that's kind of like whatever, having Al Capone keep track of the mobsters for you or something like that. So that doesn't happen.
Right.
All right. So now we have, now that kind of like really bothers me, and I'm listening to that and watching that and all, and I thought, you know, what's wrong with that picture? And then Donald Rumsfeld, the guy that was in charge of the Department of Defense at that time, came forward on the floor of the Congress. Now, this is important, is the date that he did this, the day before the 9/11 terrorist event in New York. Rumsfeld came forward on the floor of the Congress and said that he had lost, the Department of Defense had lost $2.3 trillion. He said it went back a few years, but apparently they just can't locate it. They don't know where it went. $2.3 trillion over about 10 years. Then, of course, we had the next day was the event that occupied the news for the next 7, 8 months, for crying out loud, and that was the outrageous event in New York City. End of story. You never heard again. You never heard a word about Rumsfeld and the Department of Defense missing and losing their money. And by the way, that amount of money equals $8,000 for every man, woman, and child in the United States of America. That's how much that is.
Wow.
Okay, so let's move forward. What else bothered me? The woman who's in charge of keeping track of the Federal Reserve distribution of funds from the Federal Reserve into international banking, she came out and somebody asked her on the floor of the Congress in an inquiry that they had understood that somehow there was $9 trillion off of the books progressively over the last few years of the banking Federal Reserve being lent out to people, banks, bank systems in Europe, but that they understood it was quote-unquote off the books, and it was not really definable as to where it had gone. And she had not acknowledged that that was a fact. So there's $9 trillion. Now, we're not even talking billions. We're talking trillion here. And again, it was progressive over a period of time, but basically she said that she would look into it. But, yeah, she understood there was sort of a, you know, again, they just were not positive where it had gone to. So, anyhow, done deal. There goes $9 trillion. By the way, that works out to about $30,000 for every man, woman, and child in the United States of America. So we're almost getting serious money here. So anyhow, when I put all this together, and then there was many, many other outrageous situations with huge, gigantic amounts of money just vanishing progressively over 10, 15, 20 years. So now you got to realize, see, there's no way to money launder $1 trillion. Not you can't, $1 trillion. And we're talking 2.3 vanished from the Defense Department. If you were slick enough to embezzle that out of the funding of the Defense Department, You can't go to the local bank and hide it in your safety deposit box. All right, not even Pablo Escobar, the drug smuggling operations, they couldn't do anything with that. So I sat, and I was thinking, what in the world? Where could money like that go to? What are we talking about here? And again, it's 20, 30 years maybe altogether. This is a total outrageous volume vanished. And then I remembered somebody in '94 had come to me, not just one person, but many people, and I was involved with a bunch of different things, and I'd testified before the U.S. Intelligence Committee myself in Washington on a couple of things. And the bottom line was, I recalled somebody saying, Bob, are you familiar with the underground facilities that they're building all over the United States? These giant underground hideouts. And of course I said, well, I was familiar with some of the military operations, of course, and I knew we had some of the biggest and best underground facilities on Earth for NORAD and that type of operations. And then of course somebody said, well, I'm talking about like even at the Denver airport is a giant underground facility. And of course I had a friend that was real close to that, and a couple other people that were involved in the financing and what have you of government and all of that. So I was familiar, and I also was familiar that had gone from being a construction of a fancy airport into being extraordinarily over budget. I mean, they kept going, 40 million here, 60 million there, 20 million here. I mean, it just kept going right through the ceiling in terms of cost factor. And after they finished it in '95 and opened it up for use, I had gone with a friend of mine, and we snuck down underground into some of the facilities below, and they were huge. They were gigantic. We had tunnels and tunnels and all kinds of offices and what have, just all kinds of things underneath there. Had nothing to do with the airplanes coming in and out, and entire 7-floor buildings that were buried underground there and what have you. And to date, now that was in '95, and I actually photographed and got some film, whatever, that actually somebody ended up stealing, but it doesn't make any difference because now we do have we have a lot more. I have live footage underneath these facilities as we speak. But the point was that was a heads up for me. And then I had remember talking to some truck drivers, said they had gone from one facility to another facility, probably 800 miles away, driving in his 18-wheeler, 40-foot truck, making deliveries between different points underground. And by the way, we're talking about facilities so large that 2 lanes cross each other for 18-wheelers underground, and mag-levitated trains going as fast as the speed of sound underground from one location to another. So the next point in my process of looking into this stuff was also the realization that somebody had come to me. Here's what had happened. So to explain this, once I got involved with all of this stuff and had been doing it for 30 years, I had so many people coming, and they would say, hey, I work for the CIA, or I work for this, or I work for that. And I mean, I would meet them in some cases face to face. Several of them became friends, and they would just say, "Look, I can't come out. I'll get blown away, But let me just give you this." And I would get a packet of information, or I would get some photographs, or I would get this, or get that, or whatever. And that happened over and over again because so many of the bad guys were the same bad guys, interfaced with people 10, 20 years ago, and now they're mixed with a different group, maybe 3 or 4 other guys, and they're carrying out more covert operations around the world, doing A, B, and C. So that was what had happened to me. See, so it ended up where I was like a sounding board, and I used to, again, when different investigations came up, congressmen, senatorial offices, et cetera, would call me and they would say, hey, we're looking into this. Do you have anything with this guy and that guy or that bank or this? And I would say either no, I don't, or I would say, oh, yeah, wait a minute. He was involved with A, B, and C over there 5 years ago. So that was what had happened. That was what had created my original lifestyle, if you will, and keeping me in this junk. So now let's get back to all the crazy stuff going on underground. I had somebody came to me and said, you know, these underground facilities, they're all over the United States, but to add to it, they're doing it all over the world, in the major nations of the world are doing a similar thing, building these underground hideouts. And they said, well, let me show you this in Russia. Let me show you what they're doing in China. Let me show you this. So then I started thinking, what in the world's going on? All of a sudden, these criminals have been stealing millions for their own pockets. Now they shifted gears, and they're stealing billions and billions, adding up to trillions, and they're building underground hideouts. And then I looked into it, and I found out that they were filling them with survival foods by the tons and tons and tons of underground facilities being filled with tons and tons of survival dried foods and goods and material. Then I found out they had some facilities where they were had set up underground growing operations so that they could grow actually foodstuffs in certain of these underground facilities. Then I found out about a thing called the International Seed Vault. Now that's not terribly secret, but basically it's up in Norway, and it goes into the side of a granite frozen mountain in Norway, kind of on an island, if you will, highly secured, totally secret entrances only with military guards, etc. But they have seeds to regenerate all living foodstuffs on the face of the earth if, in fact, all of those things were eliminated. If all of a sudden everything was wiped out and we had to replant, we have multi-millions of seeds in the Norway International Seed Vault. Oh, wow, that's pretty strange. All right, so now I'm adding all this stuff up, and then someone comes to me. Oh, and by the way, the Russians, in 2010, they put out a mandate for themselves internally to build and create 5,000 underground emergency shelters. That was in 2010. Their mandate was to accomplish that by 2013. That was a targeted date. They did complete them for the most part. Most of them are small. They're not what I'm talking. They're not 8,000 or 10,000 people to get underground. They're smaller facilities. But one of them can handle over 60,000 people underground in Russia. All right? So, and then, like I said, we have these, and then China's been doing the same thing. They have, and these are dug with these gigantic digging, tunnel boring machines that are so large. The bigger ones, they can go a couple of miles a day into the side of a mountain, and when they're done, back out, and you could drive an 18-wheeler down where they've been. That's it. Just punch a big hole, come back out, and you could drive an 18-wheeler facility into the side of a mountain or underground. So that's how they're built in terms of the basic drilling of these things. The Red Chinese have one single drill that is 3 of them in tandem, big enough so that they go into the side of a mountain, pull it out, and 2 18-wheelers can go side by side, driving into or under the ground with these facilities. So the next point obviously was, what in the world, what is the possible reason for this kind of expenditure of funds? And by the way, see, if anybody wants to know, everybody ever scratch their head and say, how come they don't fix 50,000 bridges and tunnels and what have you in the United States of America, all of our infrastructure? They haven't spent a penny on that stuff in 30 years. We have bridges today with 1 million cars going over it every day into major cities that technically should be condemned. You know, and the numbers of that, by the way, and of course all this stuff, you know, a guy can individually look up on your computers. You want to find about, just put something in your computer like Google, like infrastructure problems in America, and put that up, and you see the figures. It'll blow your mind. But they're not doing anything. They're not doing anything on any of that stuff. The money is not there. Where's all the money? The money is underground in these hideouts for the elite. They then also spent in the last few years millions and millions of dollars buying military equipment for the police and the sheriffs and for security operations, bullets, machine guns, under the title of, how about the Forest Rangers with 15 million bullets purchased under their name. You know, not only Forest Ranger, how about the Internal Revenue Service? Thousands of bullets and machine guns and that type of stuff. All right? So we say, what's that got to do with it, Bob? Well, it has to do with social riot control up on the top of the ground when the elite are down under the ground. And then finally it came to me, exactly, I don't remember what it was. Maybe I told some people I was looking into all these different things, and somebody simply said, well, you know, Nibiru, Planet X, has been finally really discovered, and it's coming back. So then I started doing some snooping because I didn't even know what they were talking about. And I said, well, you know, I remember something about that. And back, as a matter of fact, in the 50s and the 60s, it was like in Look magazine, Reader's Digest, and for all of our young people out there, these were big, important magazines in the United States that were better than most of the newspapers. And they had done stories about Planet X in the early 50s and 60s. But at that time, they said, even if it was really found and located, don't worry about it because it's 50 or 60 years from now, right? Uh-oh. Guess what, guys? It's 50 or 60 years since they wrote those stories, okay? So now's the time you do start worrying about it. Somebody brought to my attention a fellow named Zachariah Sitchin. It's a guy that had done the had gone into the Sumerian clay tablets. By the way, there was like thousands and thousands discovered over there in Iran, going back 4,000 years. And he deciphered them and discovered that there was this planet called Nibiru, which is Planet X, or part of the same small system, that was coming around, had come around several different times, but it had been written up in these clay tablets that basically that was what had generated Noah's floods. One of the close passings of this Planet X, Nibiru, was what had created the floods in Noah's time. Now, there's always all kinds of, because when you start going back 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years and deciphering things and analyzing them and all, it takes an awful lot of study to do the right comparisons as to time and date. The dates have all changed. Calendars had changed. There's differences of biblical time relative to calendars and timekeeping relative to other nation states at that going back that far in antiquity. But the Bible writes about it. The Quran writes about it. There have been cave drawings and writings on the walls that writes about it. And then, of course, when Dr. Sitchin finished doing his deciphering of this thing and said that it was going to be coming back around, of course, it's a typical human nature, just like Alex Jones being afraid of the fact that it might be true. It's human nature in science that if you don't have a good video of this thing, nobody believes you. It takes an awful lot to get science to change their opinions or change their precepts of things, events, astronomy, whatever it is. But lo and behold, Dr. Sitchin finds out that a fellow named Dr. Harrington, who ran actually was the head of the observatory, the Naval Observatory for the United States of America. He got interested in Sitchin's proposal on this faraway planet that has this huge orbit, goes way out and then comes back in again and then way out again. And he started looking into it and kind of studied it for about 10 years, I guess. And then finally he said, we think we found it. Now, this is the naval astronomy, the actual planetarium observatory, if you will, for the United States Navy. And this guy ran it. Okay? He called Sitchin in to his offices and sat down with him. And I'm not sure off the top of my head. I have 10 million things in my feeble little mind here, but I don't have the exact date. It's not important. I think it was 1990. And so Sitchin sits down with Harrington. Harrington says, I agree with you. I think that you're absolutely right. And as soon as he said that, in a short period of time, he became ill and he died of cancer in about, within a couple of years before he was able to complete his official report. Now, people, of course, could throw stones at that since the final report was never accomplished, but we have the actual videotape of the meeting between Sitchin and Harrington when Dr. Harrington admitted he was right and they had found it.